Welcome back to Heart of Poland. Now, the subject of today's conversation, if you haven't heard of him before, will quite literally blow you away. We are going to discover the incredible story of Władysław Bartoszewski. And I'm here again with historian Alex Richie. Hello, Alex.
Hello.
Now, by curious coincidence or happenstance, I don't know quite what the correct word for it is, you are actually the daughter-in-law of Władysław Bartoszewski.
Yes.
Do you remember the first time you met him?
I do. It was 1986 in Oxford, and I had met my husband a short time before that. I had no idea who he was, either my husband or Władysław Bartoszewski, when I met my husband. In fact, just to backtrack a little bit, I met him at St. Antony's College at Oxford, which was known as the Spy College. And back in the day, the Soviet Union and Soviet occupied countries would send their sort of elite to go and be educated in the UK from time to time.
Oh, really?
And I thought, oh my God, this guy's a Soviet spy of some kind. Anyway, so I very quickly learned that this was absolutely not the case, and that a little bit about Wladek's father. His name is also Władysław Bartoszewski, Jr., I guess. And so he came to talk at Oxford in 1986. And I remember just being just overwhelmed by his sense of humor and his love of life and joy of life. And I thought, if this is really the guy who did all these things, was in Auschwitz? Oh my goodness, because his energy and enthusiasm was just overwhelming from the very beginning.
Now, I must admit I didn't know a huge amount about his story, but I've uncovered it, and it literally is gobstopping or gobsmacking. I'm not sure what the English word for it is. I mean, over 60 awards for his work. I think 50 books published, thousands of articles.
Yes.
Not to mention his wartime career and everything that happened to him after the Second World War. And I sat there thinking, I can't believe I haven't really heard about Władysław Bartoszewski. But we'll get on to that. Let's just, if you can, if you can just talk about the picture of the experience that he went through during the Second World War. Who is Władysław Bartoszewski in brief? Yeah. Hard question.
Hard to do, impossible. Well, the thing that I've discovered and learned more and more and more about is, this is not unique to him, is that to understand how a person behaves in something as dramatic as a wartime situation very often depends on where they were born, how they were brought up, where they were educated, and their value system. And that's very, very much the case with him. One of the things, he was, of course, part of this so-called Columbus generation, that generation that had come of age in the newly created post-World War I Poland. They loved their country, very patriotic in that sense. And would fight for it. There's sort of real understanding that when in 1939 the Germans started bombing Warsaw, for example, there's this fury, this anger that they're going to take over this country which this young generation cared so much about and was so passionate about. So he was part of that world, which also explains why so many people fought so hard in the Warsaw Uprising, for example, why it was very much a young people's movement. So he was part of that, but he also had other experiences. First of all, his education, which was very, very forming for him, his family bond, which was very, very strong, very sort of decent, upright Polish family. But he also had experiences which made him a little bit different. So, for example, his father worked in the National Bank, newly created National Bank, and he grew up next to the Jewish district, playing with Jewish kids and so on. And I think that in Warsaw in Poland at that time, it's not that that was totally undone, but it was less common than certainly it is now. And so when he was confronted by the choices he made later on in his life, I think that experience is also made him really understand human beings, each single one, as valuable.
I've suddenly realised what a stupid question it is to ask someone to summarise his life, because his life is just so incredible. So maybe let's take it sort of, key incident. He's serving in the civilian defence of Warsaw in September 1939 as these waves of bombers are coming over, and then finally the German forces arrive. You obviously sat down with him and no doubt had many long
times,
conversations.
Yeah, many times. He was a volunteer for the Red Cross and was a stretcher bearer. He was taking people out of the rubble. They lived at this point, he lived in a flat just off Platz Wilsona in Żoliborz. And the Germans decided that they were going to do a roundup, arresting all men between the age of 16 and 60 in that area. And he was caught in this roundup. The Germans came to their flat and sort of banged on the door and took him.
And what did he tell you that was like? I mean, it must have just been terrifying.
Terrifying.
He's 18 years old.
18 years old. And they were brought to a kind of stables in Łazienki Park. They were made to sit there for 2 days. Nobody knew what was going on. They weren't allowed to speak. They were kept on the ground where the hay and horse dung and so on was, and then put on a train. And then the classic story, trying to see where they were going. They thought they were going to Częstochowa. They thought they were maybe going to a work camp. Interestingly enough, Witold Pilecki was also on the same train. They didn't know each other at that point, but and brought to Auschwitz. The train doors open and it's a rouse, and the German shepherd dogs and people being beaten, and then seeing the Arbeit macht frei sign, and then being expected to line up on the Appellplatz and being told by the commandant that the only way out was going to be through the crematorium chimney. So as an 18-year-old by himself, he was absolutely petrified, and the experience at Auschwitz, completely changed his life and his outlook on life.
How did he survive Auschwitz?
Well, he almost didn't. I mean, the whole concept behind Auschwitz was that at this point, before it became an extermination camp, which happened a year after he was released, was that you were supposed to effectively die through work. And therefore rations were minimal. You could barely survive, and your clothing was minimal. I mean, just if you were caught stuffing, cement paper bags and from cement into your outfit, you were beaten up or whatever. You were meant to die basically, and the life expectancy for most camp inmates who were working so hard was about 3 or 4 months. He got very, very ill. And he remembered being brought to the so-called infirmary, which basically had no medical equipment or anything in it, and remembered these 2 doctors debating as to whether or not they should even bother trying to save him because he was so emaciated and so ill. And one of them was against it. He said, he's no chance. And another one said, no, he's young. He's very young. He may recover. And this decision was sort of made over his head as he was in kind of going in and out of consciousness. And he did recover, fortunately. And this was at the point, sort of very much at the end of the point, where some prisoners were being allowed out of Auschwitz, and he was one of the few hundred that was given permission to leave.
A lot of people don't realise that at a certain point the camp looked very differently to how it would eventually become, and people were sort of one by one perhaps released for various reasons.
Absolutely. It was opened up as a camp for the Polish elite first, and then it became a camp for Jews, particularly Birkenau, which was a camp for the extermination of the Jewish people.
The experience of surviving Auschwitz must have just been so traumatic. Was he able in later years, and we're going to go back through his biography, was he able in later years to talk about it freely and openly with you?
Yes, he was one of those unusual people who talked about his experiences both in the war and after the war non-stop, endlessly. He wrote about it, he talked about it. This was, in fact, his mission. He was absolutely determined that the rest of the world would know what happened in these places, not just to him, but to Poland, to the Jewish population, to the Slavic population. He was absolutely adamant that only through confronting and being honest about this history and talking about it and debating it and so on, could this cliche, it won't happen again, really come true. If you just bury it put it away somewhere, don't talk about it, don't talk about your experiences, then how are we to learn? How are we to try and sort of guide against it? But just to finish the point, that at the end of the uprising, he was confronted by some Germans, and he did a sort of very foolhardy thing, jumping out of a vehicle and opening up the back and so on, and taking the very great risk that he might be shot or whatever. But he said he had to do it because he just could not face the thought of being sent back to Auschwitz. He took this risk because he simply could not even contemplate going back to that hell. It was so imprinted on his mind. And he still had nightmares about that conversation at the Appellplatz when the commandant said, you're going out through the crematorium and so on.
It's just surviving that alone would make him a person of note. But he's released through the intercession, I think, of the Red Cross. Is that correct? How does that work?
Because he worked for the Red Cross, had some influence. But the Germans did release a certain number of prisoners, and he was young and he wasn't political. He hadn't done anything particular, and so it's part of those releases of people that they considered to be safe to release, I suppose.
He goes back to Warsaw, and rather than frankly hiding, if I'd gone through that, imagine the last thing I'd want to do would be involved in anything ever again. He goes and starts serving and doing. So the number of things he's involved in during the Second World War and the conspiracy, it's absolutely mind-boggling.
Well, the first thing he does was he came back. He was extremely ill. It took months and months for him to recover, and he he dictated the very first eyewitness testimony from Auschwitz. It was called Memoir of a Prisoner, and it was brought to the Home Army in London, and then was distributed. People like Churchill and the Western Allies saw this. It was the first actual testimony of the camp, because people didn't know what it was yet. I mean, it wasn't famous as it is today. People weren't sure what was going on there. And then he went to try to figure out what to do. He became a member of the AK, but then he went to speak to his priest at Wyszytki church in Warsaw, saying, what do I do? And his priest said, help people who are even worse off than you are. You've been saved for a reason. You've been spared for a reason. You've seen this horrible place. Now do something. And so he became one of the co-founders of Żegota, which was an organization specifically set up to aid the Jews in Poland. So he became part of this organization. Bringing money was brought in and from the West, and an organization set up to help, for example, provide false documents for Jews trying to hide, trying to provide food and other material to the ghetto, for example, and many other things. And indeed, there's a small museum in Wrocław, which is dedicated to both he and Jan Nowak-Jażoranski, in which the Felicia archive is kept, which is tiny little pieces of paper documenting some of the transactions between Jews and Żegota, saying, well, we're giving you this money to do this and that or whatever else. And it's a kind of a documentation of the fact of the sorts of work that this incredible organization was doing. It was unique in Europe.
Was he able to sort of recover a joy in life in these terrible circumstances, having gone through this terrible experience? Because you're still a young, well, okay, you say man because you're 19, 20 sort of age, but I would just wonder, how much can you kind of recover your adolescence having gone through all of these experiences and being involved in this conspiracy?
Well, I think he was just that sort of person. I mean, people do make either their personality or their character as such, or they make the decision to either, as you say, go and hide, or be resentful, or be sort of violent against this terrible fate of yours, or you can choose another path, which is to be positive and try and find something to grasp on, to work with. And that was his way of doing this. But as I said, he was absolutely driven by the need, the desire to document what had happened. And of course, for him, the very worst thing that happened was after the war, after the uprising, he ended up spending 6.5 years in Stalinist prison. And for somebody who was very energetic and just constantly moving around and so on, to be stuck in prison again was even more of a torment than anything else. It was dreadful.
Well, we'll get there. But there's still a few noteworthy things coming up. I mean, it really is extraordinary. It's a Wikipedia entry. It was mind-boggling. Because, of course, as you've already mentioned, he takes part in the Warsaw Uprising.
Yes.
And the battle breaks out. What does it look like for him?
Well, he's in Śródmieścia. So therefore, it's one of the last areas in Warsaw to be targeted by the Germans. He was very involved in things like creating false documents and so on for people. Was very, very much involved in that sort of propaganda and disinformation and false documents and so on. But of course, the day of capitulation for him was heartbreaking, because they of course thought somehow that they would prevail, even to the very end of his life. He was like, just obviously incredibly moving, terrible event for him to have to leave Warsaw, which he did. He didn't go as a POW. He escaped and went to Krakow. And
you mentioned he jumped off the back of a truck.
That was actually a little bit earlier, at the end of the uprising. But that was simply another episode in his life. But he managed to escape to go to Krakow and hid out in Krakow, and then came back to Warsaw as soon as he could after the war. He was an absolute beloved citizen of Warsaw, loved the city of Warsaw, and really dedicated his life to it in many ways. So, and then right from the beginning was documenting, what had happened in Auschwitz, what had happened during the roundups in Warsaw. The book he wrote, the Warsaw Death Ring, and in fact, even I remember being in Warsaw with him from time to time, and people would come up to him and say, if it wasn't for you in that book, I wouldn't have known where my mother had died or where my grandfather was killed or whatever. I mean, it was just an extraordinary thing. And then again, after the war, he worked for the Red Cross. They were looking at the sites of mass executions, trying to piece together any remnants of people's lives, any kind of documentary or other evidence of what had happened to the citizens of Warsaw.
And he's also working for NIE, the kind of independence organisation, as spies, as far as the Soviets were considered. What was that? What did that? Well, espionage look like?
Yes, he was very anti-Soviet. Being in Stalinist prison didn't help that at all. But he was very active, for example, in things like supporting Radio Free Europe, and worked effectively with the CIA. Of course, never admitted that till way after the collapse of communism, because that would have been a death sentence right there. But when he was put into prison, he wasn't charged with anything. They couldn't find anything on him, so he was kept in prison for 6.5 years without charge, and they just kept on signing the form to send him back.
But so he was originally arrested.
Yes.
Espionage was the standard trumped up.
Yes,
title.
But they had nothing to pin on him, as it were, because he had been very, very careful. But they were quite capable of putting people in prison even without any evidence, and this is what happened to him.
Let's talk briefly then about what it looked like when he's in these prisons at the start, at least. I mean, these are places where they're still torturing people and executing people. Terrible crimes are committed in Rakowiecka and other prisons. Yes. When he talked to you about it, what did he? He's been in Auschwitz.
Yes.
So it can't get worse than that.
Well, Stalinist prison was awful too, because you simply didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, he often said that they were always terrified if there was any kind of people were taken away, because they weren't sure if they were going to be taken, to the east. And if you went to the east, that was the end of your life, probably. Another thing that was done to humiliate the Polish political prisoners or AK prisoners or whatever was to put them in with German criminals. So, for example, Mocharski sat with Jürgen Stroop, and my father-in-law was put in with various Germans who were being held on charges of what they'd done in Warsaw during the war. In other words, to say you are as on the same level, according to the Soviet mentality, as these terrible German criminals had been. But he had, partly because of his experience in Auschwitz, he also learned how to survive in prison, how to organize in prison, how to read the signs of this. There's a prison language, even in Auschwitz. For example, everything was for sale. You just had to know how to save up your pieces of bread to get whatever it was you needed or whatever. There's a whole prison language and a whole prison way of being, which is probably universally true. And so surviving in Stalinist prison was in some ways easier for him because he'd had that experience. So he did talk about that as well, and what it was like, and how you survive, and how you get through the day. But they did things like, kept him in a cell and the light bulb on all the time. He had very bad eyesight anyway, and so this really destroyed his eyes. And there were all sorts of other ways, mock executions, all sorts of other things to do to harm a prisoner.
So I have to go back to this trauma. Trauma of Auschwitz, trauma of being this horrible. I've stood in the prison cells, as I'm sure you have as well, and you just think about what that daily life looked like, the lack of dignity, being stuck with these horrible war criminals and things. It almost sounds like a stupid question now, when you think about the strength of character. It hasn't broken him, this experience, so presumably it's made him tougher. He's still going to go on through a lot of trauma throughout the rest of his life under the long years of communist oppression. Is there some positives that he drew from this? Did he talk about these experiences like, this made me a better person, despite it all?
Well, certainly not being incarcerated. I don't think that is a positive thing for anybody. I think what it did do was made him furious against the Soviet system, and determined to destroy it in any possible way he could. He knew that this had been imposed on Poland. It wasn't something that people chose to do. He was absolutely convinced that should communism disappear, that Poland would become a free and democratic society, a Western, society. This is exactly his view and his aim. And I was thank goodness that he survived long enough to see that happen in 1989.
Why didn't he leave? Because so many did.
So many people did. He was determined to fight it here in Poland, fight the system from within, because he feared, I think, that he would be less relevant if he went abroad. There were so many people. He had many friends in the UK and in the United States and other countries as well. Jan Nowak, Jerzhansky, many people in Britain as well. But he feared that if he did that he would not have the same sort of impact. And he fought and fought and fought. There was sort of 7 meters of Secret Service files because he was under surveillance all the time. I lived for a time in his house. The neighbor on one wall had allowed the Secret Service to drill in through the wall into his study, so there were microphones there so that they could listen to conversations. And there were 7 meters of files on him from this surveillance, just simply reporting on his every move. One of the great ironies, in fact, was that my husband grew up with him, of course, and all of these conversations of, Dad, I have to take the dog to the vet or whatever, were all recorded. Of course, nothing of any real importance was recorded because he knew he was being followed and listened to. So there's absolutely nothing of any importance. But it's my husband's whole childhood life is actually documented in these files because they copied down and wrote down everything. So,
and do you have the?
Yes, we have the copies of the files. It's hilarious. It's just a completely unintended consequences of this kind of surveillance society.
What's it like growing up as the son of this? Because he later becomes this national hero. Once communism falls, we were skipping Solidarność, but perhaps we'll go back to that. Władysław Bartoszewski is rightly recognised as one of these great heroes of Poland's Second World War experience. As well. What is it like? I'm always fascinated by this, of growing up in the shadow, or was it a sense of, this is Dad and this is what he does? I think
it was a sense of this is Dad and this is what he does, but again, a very, very strong sense of values. His mother, Władek's mother, was also in the uprising. She was very highly decorated, got Virtuti Militari, more highly decorated militarily than
yes.
His father, for fighting in the women's unit of Kedif, which was an elite organization. So again, both sides of the family, and they would. He simply took for granted that you would meet with underground figures from the AK, figures from the conspiracy or whatever else. It was simply understood. They didn't have communication with, contact with, or whatever, communists or that whole world in Poland just simply didn't exist for them.
If you're wondering, dear viewer, why we've had so many different episodes filmed with Alex, I think you already now know why, because there's so many different stories we could tell, including, of course, Władek's wife, Antonia, if I remember
yes.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about Solidarność then, before we get into Free Poland. What's he doing in the ranks of Solidarność?
Well, he was involved, he obviously was from immediately after his release from prison, was working, fighting, writing, editing, whatever he could to fight against the communists, basically. And so it was a natural step to be involved in solidarity. He was active, and he was incarcerated in 1981 under martial law.
For a long time.
Well, yes, but some months, and but again, ironically, being in prison with some of the great figures of Solidarność was counterproductive for the communists, because of course they sat and talked together about what they were going to do next. It was a completely sort of counterproductive move on the part of the communist government. But he was convinced that sooner or later, in some way, somehow, that communism was such a ridiculous system that somehow it was going to implode. He didn't know when, and I don't think he predicted that it was going to be 1989. The only person I actually knew who really talked about this was this big Brzezinski, was also a friend of ours, who actually, I remember he came to Oxford once, and 1987 or 86 was talking about the communism has to collapse, and everybody just sort of laughed at him and said, that's ridiculous. And my father-in-law actually did believe it, but he didn't think it was going to happen so quickly, maybe not in his lifetime.
Now, looking back at these 3 incarcerations, 3 prison sentences, one Auschwitz, second in that horrible period where Stalin's still alive,
yes.
And then the third in the 80s. Is there anyone's life in Poland? I always used to think this was true of Witold Pilecki, that better classifies the Polish experience of the 20th century.
No, I think that it really does. It's incarceration, Poland being attacked both by the Hitler dictatorship, totalitarian regime, and then by Stalin. That's Poland's tragedy, is its geographical location between these two, in the 20th century anyway, very often aggressive, oppressive regimes. And then this longing, this deep-seated desire for freedom, and for freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of whatever it is. There's all of the great democratic ideals that I think are so ingrained in Poland and in the Polish ideal and the Polish character, if you will, if there is such a thing. And he embodies this, absolutely.
I mentioned he had 60, I think, medals, awards and recognitions, along with a whole bunch of other titles and so forth. One of them was, of course, Righteous Amongst the Nations, given by the Yad Vashem Foundation. And he accepts it also on behalf of Żegota, the organisation that he'd been...
I think he's one of the only, if not the only person who was awarded Righteous Amongst Nations twice. So he's awarded because of Żegota, and he's also given his own tree at Yad Vashem as well. So he's got 2 different things. Was also made an honorary citizen of Israel, and was passionate about the again, history of what had happened to the Jews in Poland and elsewhere, and was very, very much a supporter of Israel.
Then he's in Free Poland, and that dramatic transformation which takes place in Poland. What does he do in those years in the 90s?
Well, he was invited to be ambassador to Austria, and this really, I suppose, started a new phase of his career, because it was unthinkable before that to have even think about any kind of political office, and so many of my husband's friends, for example, ended up being things like art historians, because that was the only thing that was not political. You're not going to go and be anything else in communist Poland, and this was very much the case with Władek's father. So after the collapse of communism, there was a need for well-educated people who had been through these sorts of experiences, had been involved in solidarity, whatever else, to fill these new offices. So he became, first of all, ambassador, and then he was twice foreign minister, and was a minister without portfolio just before his death in the government, responsible largely for reconciliation and dialogue between Poland and Germany, and Poland and Israel. This was, again, very much a passion of his.
He spoke fluent German,
Fluent German,
He had a photographic memory, I've also read
Absolutely,
as well.
had an incredible memory. And so when I would have long discussions with him about the Warsaw Uprising when I was working on the book, and he was an absolute fount of knowledge, but also because he remembered names, faces, dates, and you'd say, well, I just got this document, and it says something about so-and-so on this street, and he'd go, yes, 1943, it was walking down the street here, it was at this address, and then he brought this piece of paper, blah, 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 and he was sort of like, it was unbelievable, just an unbelievable memory.
Let's talk about the way that he tried to rebuild relations with Germany. I think the German president came to his funeral, which was an extraordinary sign of just how much he'd contributed to Poland-German relations.
Yes.
You've already talked about this, but again, this person who survived Auschwitz, the absolute horror, the greatest horror that man has visited upon man, and, the horror of all the horrors. And yet here he is trying to rebuild relations between these two countries. Why was that important for him?
Well, it was very important because he did not see the Nazis as the Germans. He understood very clearly after what he'd seen that people are or choose or are made into the criminals that they became. They were that criminality was developed. The Germans were not like that in World War I. They became that way. They were made that way. And his view was that you have to unmake that. You have to show a path and create a dialogue and so on, so that doesn't happen, that people don't have those stereotypes of each other. And there were many, many stories my husband remembers when he was small, when my father-in-law and my mother-in-law would invite Germans to the house for dinner or whatever. And the neighbors would simply not speak to them because how could you? How could you possibly have a relationship with these terrible people who'd done these terrible things? But he, of course, identified Germans who felt terrible about what had happened and were trying to learn about that past. And were trying to set up, for example, criminal trials or trying to confront that past, which I think that, generally speaking, the Germans have been very, very successful in doing. And his view was that you have to reward that, you have to promote that, you have to cultivate that. It's not going to happen by itself. And if you, as a Pole, have been through Auschwitz, then you extend the hand, and that if it's reciprocated, then you're going much, much further to preventing that from ever happening again.
What was the private Władysław Bartoszewski like?
He was hilariously funny, for one thing. Absolutely hilariously funny. Completely irreverent, sense of humor. Great fun. That's the first thing I would say is just the amount of fun we had. And he was a wonderful father-in-law, and he was a wonderful grandfather. My children just adored him. And things that you wouldn't expect, like they would always draw pictures for him and this kind of thing, and he was always very funny and would make comments about what they looked like or whatever. Just a lovely man. So if in our private life, we didn't sort of think about the fact that he was this hugely famous and amazing and person who'd been in Auschwitz or whatever. It was just fun to be around him and talk. And he loved talking about history and politics, but family as well.
I called it happenstance at the start. It certainly was quite good from a historian's point of view that you landed in that particular place.
Yes. I mean, it was a complete fluke, as I said. I had no intention or idea about who he was when I met my husband at Oxford, but he turned out to be a hugely important part of my life for over 30 years. He was a very, very close friend and a very important mentor and a person I loved deeply and I miss terribly. It was just a very, very important part of my life, particularly as I came to live in Poland and was far away from my own family. So he became very much more than, a sort of figurehead. He was very, very much a part of my day-to-day life.
He was buried, I think, with full state.
Yeah, he had a state funeral.
Funeral, just 3.5 years ago or so. Mm-hmm. When you stand at his grave in the military cemetery at Pawonsky, where he was buried, what kind of emotions? I'm sure you go there.
I do. I feel, as I said, I still kind of talk to him as if he's still around, because I think that's one way of coping with the loss of somebody who you really love, is to say, what would he say right now? What would he do? What would he, what comments would he make? What would he think? So yes, when I go there, I actually give thanks for having had the tremendous privilege of knowing him, and through him also meeting so many other incredible Poles and Germans and Israelis and Americans because of his life. He brought those people together, and so I just feel humbled, honored, tremendous sense of thankfulness that I had the tremendous privilege of knowing this person.
Well, Alex, thank you very much for sharing his story, because I'm sure viewers, you will agree by now that Władysław Bartoszewski is an extraordinary figure in the history of Poland and one well worth getting to know. And I must admit, as I said at the start, that I didn't really understand his story, and it's been wonderful hearing it through you. Is there any book on him that is in English, perhaps?
No, I'm writing a biography of him, so hopefully that'll come out quite soon. So.
You see what I did there? Well, definitely a subject that deserves probably more than one book as well, so we'll wait with bated breath. Alex, thank you very much for sharing the extraordinary story of Władysław Bartoszewski. So, if you've enjoyed hearing about the story of Władysław Bartoszewski, you can, of course, share this film with anyone who you think might also be interested in it. Certainly wait for this book, and I think it's probably going to be a corker to come out. And you can check out some of the fascinating conversations we've had with other fascinating people about fascinating lives of the people of Poland in this episode of Hearts of Poland, and all of the others wherever you find them on the First News channel. I'll see you again for the next episode.